Okay, so I just wanted to briefly mention an upcoming program, Historians in the News, Reflections on Xenophobia, Politics in a Historical Moment. So this is going to be a conversation between Dr. Erica Lee, who those of you may remember was our first speaker for the Hatfield Lecture Series, and one of the members on our Board of Trustees, Christopher McKnight Nichols. He is an associate professor at Oregon State University. They will be talking about the importance of historical perspective in the news. But the reason why I wanted to point out this program in particular is because any funds that we receive from this program will be going to the OHS Pandemic Survival Fund. So this fund was specifically created to help gain and replace some of the revenue that was lost this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So there is a suggested donation of $35 for the general public and $25 for OHS members, but it is a sliding scale. So if you can't if that donation is too high, feel free to donate what it is that you can, and 100% of the proceeds will be going to this survival fund. And this event is happening in October on a Wednesday from 5 to 6 p.m., October 14th specifically. And you can find out more about this program and other OHS programs by going to ohs.org/events. All right, and I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Oregon Historical Society's physical building is located in downtown Portland, which is in Multnomah County. And this area that the building is physically located on in all of Multnomah County is the traditional and ancestral homelands for the Multnomah, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations that founded their homes in the Columbia River area. Included in this slide is a screenshot from a very helpful, a resource that I found very helpful, and that is also included in our 3 through 5 units. So that's grades 3rd, 4th, 5th. Our permanent exhibit, Experience Oregon, has curriculum that accompanies it for grades kinder all the way through 12th, and this is in the 3 through 5 unit. The 3 through 5 unit does focus specifically on the history of Native Americans in Oregon. And this is a great resource, not just for educators, but for anyone who's interested in learning more about the actual Indigenous history here in Oregon. You can check out this website, native-land.ca. It has a whole bunch of interactive maps that not only tell you things such as like different treaties, but also which languages and which lands traditionally belong to which Indigenous groups historically. All right, now for tonight's presentation, Bohemians West, Free Love, Family, and Radicals in the 20th Century America, presented by Sherry L. Smith, sponsored by the Oregon Historical Society and McMinimans. So our History Pub Lecture Series, well, this is an announcement. Our History Pub Lecture Series is going to be on temporary hiatus. History Pub has been around for a decade. It has always been on the last Monday of the month. And due to financial impact from COVID-19, McMinimans is putting a pause on this until it is able to recollect itself back to its former capacity. So the program is not going away. It will just be on temporary hiatus until McMinimans is able to welcome folks back into the physical theater back at the Kennedy School. But for tonight's program, we can enjoy it with our speaker, Sherry L. Smith. All right, so these are a couple of notable works by Sherry. Sherry L. Smith is a University Distinguished Professor of History at the Southern Methodist University. She is a historian of American West and Native America history. Some of her notable works are Hippies, Indians, and the Fight for Red Power, and Reimagining Indians, Native Americans Through Anglo Eyes, 1880 to 1940. Both of those works that I just mentioned were published by the Oxford University Press. And tonight's presentation is on Sherry's most recent novel, Bohemians West, Free Love, Family, and Radicals in the 20th Century America, which was released just last month, August 2020. And you can buy this book at the OHS Museum store, which you can either go in physically at the museum or you can order it online. All right, take it away, Sherry.
Thank you very much, Isa. I am really delighted to be here this evening, although I'd rather be in the pub with you. But I understand that COVID has struck everywhere. And I do also want to thank all of you for coming. Oregon's been through a lot these last months or so, fires and other things like that. And so many of our hearts and concerns are with people in Oregon. Hopefully the skies are clearing, and thank you again for joining us tonight. When I was working on this project, I dreamed actually of the day that I could come to Portland and the Oregon Historical Society and talk about this story. It's actually a nonfiction. It's a book of history, not a novel, although I'd like to think it reads like a novel. But anyway, if there's any place in the world that people know Charles Erskine Scott Wood, it is Portland, Oregon. And not only have those people who have written about Wood or made films about Wood, do they live in Portland or in Oregon, except for Robert Hamburger, who lives in New York City. But many people have studied Wood before me, and many of them do live in Oregon and Portland. And also there are many Wood descendants in the Portland area. So I hope some of them have tuned in this evening, and if not tonight, some other time, I can actually meet some of you wonderful people face to face. The upside of this is that people from beyond Portland can join us. And so thanks again to all of those who have linked in. So as I indicated, Charles Erskine Scott Wood has been the focus of other historians and literary people's attention. But my research and story is different because it makes the central part of what I'm doing, focusing on the personal, even intimate aspects of the last 1/3 of his life. Wood has been of great interest to people because of his army experiences in the Nez Perce War, because he was a colorful character who was also deeply intelligent, literate, cosmopolitan, well-published, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, with respect to both his poetry, his essays, and also his sort of satirical pieces that he's known for. But I am going to focus on tonight, and in the book itself, I focus on his particular relationship with one woman, Sara Bard Field. Wood had relationships, affairs with a number of women beyond his wife. But Sara Bard Field is the one who actually changed his life. She disrupted the relationship, I should say, ended up disrupting his family as well as his own life. He left Portland eventually to be with her and to realize his lifelong dream, which was to be a poet, not a soldier and not a lawyer, but a poet. But in the next slide, let me just say a word actually before we move forward. These are two of my favorite images of Wood. And the one on the left side of the screen is him when he was in the army in 1877, around the time of the Nez Perce War. Wood would later claim that women were always throwing themselves at him. And I think some of the women in the audience, maybe some of the men as well, could see why he might be somewhat attractive to people. There's an attitude in this photo that I just really love. He was a man of great confidence and who I think had a sense that he was a pretty good looking fellow. The one on the right is a little bit later than when Sara first met him, but comes the closest of any I could find, I think, to what he looked like when she first met him, which was in 1910. Okay, so the next slide offers two photographs of Sara Bard Field, who is an equally important figure here and who receives actually probably more attention than Wood does in the book. She deserves attention for a number of reasons. First of all, because she was the other part of this very interesting relationship. But more than that, she deserves attention because she had a very colorful and important career as an advocate of women's suffrage. And she also was a poet and eventually a published poet. This time the photo on the left is pretty much what Sara looked like when she first met Wood. And she actually gave him this photograph and wrote it "librarily yours," thinking that she looked more like a librarian. Sorry, guys at the Historical Society, you might be librarians. And I think she looks lovely in this photograph. But the one on the right represents her a couple of years later, where you can see she kind of let her hair down and she opens up her collar, and she is looking like a very different woman by the time the second photograph is taken. So this is what Sara looked like on the left when Wood first met her. And this is what their relationship, I think, how the relationship helped reshape her into a different kind of person. Before I get into the story, I thought I would say a word about how I found the story, because this is often what people ask me when I meet them and talk about this book. So as a graduate student at the University of Washington, I was looking around for a topic to write on it. I knew I was interested in Native American history. I was also interested in women's history, but my advisor, and this was in the 70s, did not feel confident, I think, with women's history. So instead he suggested that I should write something about Army officers and Indians, how individual officers thought about, felt about fighting Native American people. Were they writing their letters and diaries about this? And I thought, well, that's a pretty interesting topic. So I decided to do what he told me to do. And it was in the course of doing that research that I discovered Charles Erskine Scott Wood. He was a reluctant soldier. His father made him go to West Point. He graduated just in time, really, when he was shipped out to the Pacific Northwest to engage in a number of expeditions, including the Nez Perce War. And at the Huntington Library, they have this wonderful Charles Erskine Scott Wood collection, which included his diaries from his Army days, his letters from his Army days. And they were absolutely fascinating because he was not, I don't think actually there was a typical Army officer, but he was really quite unusual in that he was expressing in his letters and in his diary a sensibility about what was going on politically, what it meant for Indian people to be the objects of these expeditions, and even sympathizing with them until the bullets flew, and then he sort of changed a little bit. But in his heart of hearts, he felt, I wouldn't say guilt, but he had a sensibility, a sensitivity about what these wars were about. And you can see in these letters the germs that will eventually become his rather fierce anti-imperialism later on in his life. But anyway, I found him a pretty interesting guy for that reason. But this was a huge collection. And as I was looking at the lists of all the boxes and what was in them, I saw box after box of letters that Wood was writing to this woman, and letters this woman was writing back. And I thought, well, who is this? Because I knew it wasn't his wife. So I decided to just call in one of those boxes one day, and it turned out it was this Sara Bard Field person. And it didn't take me long to realize that this was a woman with whom he was engaged in a love affair. And in the end, they wrote about 2,700 letters to one another. So you can see there was an incredible documentation of this relationship. I couldn't do it at that time. I had to go back to the Army and the Indian Wars and that sort of thing. But I said, someday I'm going to come back. And I would really like to read these letters and see if there's a story to tell. So it took me quite a while. I had a couple other books in between, which Isa was kind enough to put up on the screen that I did first. But I finally got a wonderful grant to go to the Huntington Library, which allowed me the time to spend to begin to read those letters. And as I was reading them, I thought, well, is there a book here? And my first thought was that perhaps it would be best to compile the letters in a book and just let people have the same experience that I'm having of reading other people's mail, but very interesting people's mail, and letting them just dive directly into the archive themselves. The problem was there were 2,700 letters. Also, these were not just short letters. Many of them were incredibly long. And if any of you have worked with Wood's letters, you know he would write 15, 20-page letters, handwritten, thankfully very readable, in his signature green ink. And her letters were not as long, but they were also quite long. So I just decided I couldn't be sure that people were as interested as I was, that they would stick with the story. So it would probably be better to transform the letters into a narrative. But there are a couple other reasons why I decided to go forward with this and not just do the letters. Not only were there all these letters between the two of them, many, many other letters that they wrote to their children, that their children wrote to them, that they wrote to their own spouses, that Wood wrote to Sara's spouse, as well as her lovely sister, parents, and then the many, many very famous people, literary, political figures that they knew who crossed their paths as well. So there was a documentation that went beyond the couple itself that was too rich and too compelling to ignore. But more than that, I concluded that to just look at the two of them would not do this story the justice that I thought it deserved. And I really wanted to integrate into the saga the perspectives of other people who were deeply affected by the relationship, the spouses, the children in particular. This relationship, perhaps any relationship along these lines, is not just about the two principal figures. It often has implications for others, and I wanted to tell that story as well. Another reason why I wanted to write the book was, as I began to read these letters, I was quickly drawn into the drama of Erskine and Sara. These people had incredibly interesting lives and experiences. I would go home and say, wow, I am so boring. My life is so boring. These people were living vivid. I mean, I just can't tell you how fascinating they turned out to be. And I could hardly wait to go back the next day to the library and see what was going to happen next. And I have often thought that if this were in fact a novel, an editor would have thrown out some of the things that happen in the actual story. An editor would say, this wouldn't happen, or this is too far out, you know, come on, this is too dramatic or melodramatic, this is too painful. But actually all of those things that, that represent what I just described actually did happen to this couple and to their families. And of course, they make a very good story. And although there were moments when I wondered if anybody else would be interested in this, I pretty quickly concluded that, yeah, I think this is a story with a narrative arc and power that others would like as well. Two more reasons why I wanted to write this book. They were incredibly thoughtful, reflective, conscious of what they were doing, trying to be the architects of a new way of living and a new way of loving and creating relationship. They worked very hard at explaining themselves to each other and to their family members. Some people might see them as narcissistic. Some people might say they were simply justifying their actions. However you want to say it, the fact of the matter is that these letters are full of ideas and reflections that are compelling. In addition, they were incredibly emotional people. They were artists at heart. They were poets. They experienced all kinds of emotional ups and downs, and they were pretty forthright about how they were feeling at different points in time. So there's also an emotional richness to the story that they provided to me. I mean, I didn't have to make anything up. There was a lot that they were providing and giving to me as a scholar. They were also trying to be honest above all things. They often talked about truth with a capital T. And I admired them for the effort. I also could tell when they were not being honest, when they failed to live up to their own ideals. Then my final reason that I decided to write this story is, and this might strike some of you as odd, but I decided to write this story because they wanted someone to do it. And I know they wanted someone to do it because very early on in their relationship, Erskine wrote to Sara, "Save all of our letters. Save all of our letters. We are pioneers in free love. And someday, someone will want to know how we negotiated that terrain." So it was a very self-conscious decision that Erskine in particular was making to keep a record of their relationship, not simply for themselves, but for the future, when people would be more accustomed to free love relationships and would find it fascinating to see what it was like 100 years ago to engage in such a radical relationship. So I greatly appreciate the fact that they saved the letters. I cannot be sure that they saved every single one. Some of them may have been tossed out, but I don't think very many. And I guess the reason why I really don't think they tossed very many out was because they saved those even where their actions or their attitudes were not particularly attractive. They saved those letters where they are very admirable and everybody would love spending time with them. But they also saved those where their imperfections were on full display. Okay, so that's why this book. So what's the general arc of the story itself? And the story has many layers and many aspects. And so the one that I want to emphasize tonight is the particular free love relationship between Erskine and Sara, and say a little bit about the family as well. But much of the book also deals with their more public life, the kinds of political issues that engage them, whether it was free speech or labor and suffrage. I'll say a little bit about that. They were involved in just about every issue of their day and wrote quite a bit about that as well. But tonight I'm going to focus on the personal relationship. They met in 1910 when Clarence Darrow came to Portland. Now, Wood had been living in Portland since the 1880s. He eventually left the Army. He went to law school and he came back to the Pacific Northwest and to Portland to set up a practice so that he could support his wife and family. And he was very successful in his law practice. And he was also culturally powerful. This is a sophisticated, attractive man who loved the arts and letters, and he had a lot of cultural power as well as in economic and legal power. Sara came to Portland in 1910. She was married at the time to a Baptist minister who had lost his church back in Cleveland, Ohio, where Sara was very involved in progressive politics back there. But he got a new church, got a new job in Portland, and so they headed west. And as they were getting ready to go, Sara said to Clarence Darrow, who she knew, by the way, because her wonderful sister, Mary, who was a journalist and social worker, was one of Clarence Darrow's mistresses. So she said to Clarence Darrow, I don't know about Portland. You know, it seems so far away, backwater place. He said to her, don't worry. There's a really interesting man out there I want you to meet. And I'm sure you guys will be friends. Well, Sara kind of put that aside, forgot about it, I don't know. But when Darrow came to town, he came to the Ergot's house and he said, you're coming to dinner tonight. He went to Erskine's office, said, you're coming to dinner tonight. And he put them together. He really wanted Sara to meet Erskine and vice versa. So there was much that actually separated Erskine and Sara, 30 years difference in age. He was 58 when she met him and Sara was 28. Social class also separated them. Educational background. As I said, Erskine got his undergraduate degree at West Point and then he got a law degree at Columbia. Sara was a high school graduate. Religious orientation. Erskine was an avowed atheist, and Sara, at this moment anyway, was a Baptist and married to a minister. But they also shared many things. They shared political values and views and an inclination to be politically engaged. They shared a love of literature and poetry. They shared childhoods with tyrannical fathers who dismissed their children's yearnings and ambitions. They shared dissatisfaction with their marriages. They shared sexual attraction to one another, although it might have taken a little bit while for them to realize that, but it came pretty quickly. They shared a belief that free love was preferable to traditional marriage. Now, in 1910, Erskine was full blown into free love, had been publishing about it and so forth. Sara, I don't think had given it much thought, but as she began to learn more about it and engage with Erskine, she became very much an advocate of free love as opposed to traditional marriage as well. And then finally, what they shared was a deep desire to be their true selves and to realize that they each had potential as poets and they could perhaps meet the greatest chance of success in that if they were living in relationship to one another. Sara, her husband knew, was unhappy. He was trying to help her. He loved her, of course. He was trying to help her find something that would, make her happy. And he knew that she thought that Erskine was quite an impressive person. And it was Reverend Ergot who suggested that she work for him, helping him edit his chest full of poetry that really desperately needed some editing before it could move on to publication. So it was actually Reverend Ergot who put the two of them together. Wood was happy enough to hire her to do this. He didn't feel he had many people in Portland who appreciated his poetry, and Sara clearly did. By the summer of 1911, the relationship had been consummated. And after that, Sara determined that she must leave her husband. She could no longer live in that marriage, and she knew she had to leave him. She hoped, though, that she could do that, but still retain custody of her children. But from the summer of 1911 on, Sara Bard Field's ironclad goal in life was to live with Charles Erskine Scott Wood. Wood encouraged her. He provided the economic support to pursue her freedom, to develop her gifts, and to establish a new life. But he was not in a rush to leave his family, his legal firm, or Portland. And he made clear from the start that she should not expect him to simply drop his responsibilities and run off with her. What he was waiting for, he kept telling her, was a windfall that would come to him from a long drawn out legal case that he had been involved with for a very long time. But once it was over, he stood to gain a lot of money. And it was at that point when he would receive this windfall, then he could retire from his law firm, provide generous trust funds for his wife and his grown children, and leave Portland. His children, by the way, were much older, of course, than Sara's children. They were themselves married and having children of their own when all this is getting started. But the point here is that for Erskine, his patriarchal responsibility for the economic well-being of his family was paramount to him. Now, he would have happily gotten a divorce, but his wife, Nanny, refused, and she made it abundantly clear that she would never agree to a divorce. He did feel deep frustration about this. He did believe he had never been able to be the man he was meant to be. His father made him be a soldier, a lawyer, to support his family. But as he neared 60, he wanted to pursue a life of poetry and in the context of a relationship with Sara, but she was just going to have to wait. What did they mean by free love? Essentially, individual freedom was the highest value for Erskine as a philosophical anarchist. To leave, to fall in love and to leave if we fell out of love, those were things that should be solely left up to the individuals involved. They should be unfettered by promises overseen and enforced by either the church or the state. Love did not require official sanction from either government or from religious bodies. In fact, he believed quite the opposite was the ideal. And Sara came, as I said, to agree with him on this. But there were several things upon which they differed in the relationship, and I want to spend a little time talking about that. I guess that conflict may be a little more interesting than where they agree. So a couple of different issues come out of the letters that reveal that even free love relationships could have tension in them and senses of responsibility and different ideas about what free love and responsibility meant. So as I've already indicated, one of the big differences that they had was the timing of when they would actually live together. And it took about 7 years between 1911 and then 1918 when Wood finally did leave Portland and go to live with Sara. But they were working this out, trying to work it out Sara constantly wanting him to come, and he kept putting her off pretty much consistently for the same reason that he had given her from the start. They also differed on the level of sacrifice that each one was willing to make. Sara had a lot to lose to engage in this kind of relationship in this, town the size of Portland, where everybody seemed to know everybody, particularly in Wood's circle. A woman married to a very fine man of the cloth, to leave her husband for Wood, who was known as a radical and in some quarters as a rake. She was risking a lot, but she was willing to do it, and she did it fairly quickly, and she certainly did it first. So she was risking reputation, she was risking livelihood. Her husband, of course, was supporting her. She was also risking the chance of losing her children because of the nature of the relationship. I mean, extramarital affair, adultery, whatever you want to call it. She was going to have a hard time in courts trying to retain custody of her children. But she was willing to do all of those things. And in fact, it took her a while to get the divorce. She left Portland by the end of 1912, went down to California, eventually had to go to Nevada to establish residency there to get the divorce. Reverend Ergot was fighting her tooth and nail. He did not want the divorce, but eventually he capitulated. She had, frankly, Erskine's money on her side to get the best of lawyers, and he capitulated. But she did lose custody of the children. So she had to make that great sacrifice as well. Now, during all of this trauma, she is understanding that Wood has not moved 1 inch really closer to coming to her. And so she reminds him of her sacrifices, and she pushes him to come, to join her, and to live his dreams with her. And he continues to resist and also resents the pressure that she's putting on him. Another source of tension is the issue of monogamy. I think when people hear the term free love, some people anyway, automatically it assumes promiscuity, open marriages, orgies, all that sort of stuff. Monogamy, one does not usually associate necessarily with free love. But the issue of monogamy is one that comes up between Erskine and Sara. It probably won't surprise many of you that Sara wanted a free love relationship, but she wanted a monogamous free love relationship. And it may not surprise some of you that Erskine saw it differently. He promised her this much, that she was always first in his heart. But there were many, many long stretches of time when they were not together, which is one of the reasons why we have so many letters. But during these long stretches of time apart, Erskine was not willing to put aside the possibility of a love relationship and a sexual relationship with another woman. And so during these 7 years, there were a couple of times when he did have affairs with one woman, and a second woman. So I don't want to leave the impression that he was wildly promiscuous, but his idea of free love was an emphasis on free, and that he was not demanding it of her, and he was not promising it in return. Now, this was an ongoing issue as well throughout the letters. And it was especially interesting to me because we normally think of Bohemians in their era as living in Greenwich Village. And actually, of course, Erskine knew all of those people, and Sara got to know them when she went east for the suffrage movement. And so she spent some time with the free lovers of Greenwich Village. And so she was using her observations of some of those relationships to kind of nudge Erskine to come closer to her own ideas about this. So they had very interesting conversations, not only about monogamy within their relationship, but the monogamy or lack of monogamy among some other quite famous couples' free love relationships as well. The issue was only resolved when Erskine did come to California and live with Sara, and it evaporated instantly. So once they were together, it was no longer an issue or a problem. The third area of tension that really envelops these others is the matter of power. Who exercised more of it within the relationship? And did that change over time? And if so, why? So here's the answers to those questions. Certainly in the beginning years, Erskine had the upper hand. And for many years, Sara capitulated. The reasons, of course, are clear. He was older, he was wiser, he was more experienced. He also was the one who had the money, but I want to be very careful about this. I do not mean to suggest that he was using the power of the purse over her. In fact, quite the opposite. She was truly a feminist who felt very badly about the fact that she was often depending upon him for her livelihood. And he would insist, it's, you know, you're Mrs. Rockefeller, don't worry about it. And he was never trying to use his money or his economic power to, you know, get her over to his side of issues or things like that. But the fact of the matter is that when you do have the money, that probably does mean in unconscious ways, and maybe even in unintentional ways, you can exercise more power. But things begin to change. And the changes are happening not on Erskine's side, but on Sara's side. So she's down in California. She is living on Russian Hill. She is paying the rent because she's serving as Erskine's literary editor. But she is interested in trying to find other work that she gets on her own and that provides her with her own money. And it comes to her through the suffrage movement. Her first experience, excuse me, I have a little bit of a dry throat. Her first experience in the suffrage movement actually comes in Oregon in 1912, when the men of Oregon are going to decide whether or not to enfranchise women. And a good friend of Sara's recruits her to go around the state of Oregon and stump for suffrage, going to all the little towns, particularly in Eastern Oregon, but also in Eugene and Portland and the western part of the state as well. She would go there, get on top of a car. She was a slim, attractive woman, just would attract the attention of particularly the men who were getting off of work, and she was a terrific orator. And so she was finding her voice and enjoying the fact that she was engaged in an important political issue and having some success at this as well. As some of you undoubtedly do know, in 1912, in the November election, the men of Oregon did in fact vote to enfranchise women. So this was a wonderful moment of success for her, and she felt good about herself, even though in her personal life it was just awful because she was still married to Ergot and going home to Ergot. And so anyway, but in terms of her politics, this was a really good introduction to her for the work in the suffrage movement. So she goes to California. She knows other women who bring her in to the women's booth, which is at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. There's a women's booth put up by a group that becomes the National Women's Party, and Sara was in charge of that booth. And among the things that they were doing there was they had this huge parchment paper on a big roll, and they were asking all the men and women voters, and by this time, almost all of the women in Western states had been enfranchised, to sign the petition demanding an amendment to the Constitution that would enfranchise all women across the country. So there were, by the end of this thing, the parchment paper petition was supposed to be 4 miles long, and thousands of men and women voters had signed it. Well, what to do with it? And Alice Paul, who was the head of the National Women's Party, had the great idea that Sara Bard Field, and that's her on the left in this photograph, and these 2 Swedes who were Americans who had purchased this car in California, drive across the country and deliver the petition to Congress and also to President Wilson. The two women were on their way back to Rhode Island anyway, so they were going there, so Sara went along with them. And this was a brilliant public relations move. It brought incredible attention to these women. I mean, to drive across the street, you know, first of all, many people didn't think women were capable of driving. And to drive across the street as a woman was sometimes controversial, but to drive across the country was totally unheard of. So it was an incredible adventure. It brought a lot of attention, and it brought, frankly, fame to Sara. People were writing newspaper articles all across the country, and they were a big sensation, even in good old New York, where they'd seen everything. The suffrage car was of great interest. And then when they came to Washington, D.C., there was a parade, and they went to Congress, and they went up the steps, delivered it to Congress, and they went on to talk to President Wilson as well. So Sara was coming into her own here as not only a symbol, but a really solid speaker and fundraiser for the suffrage movement. Alice Paul wanted her to stay in the East and work there, but Erskine was in the West, and so she had no interest in staying in Washington, D.C. or New York City. But here again, she's beginning to see herself as strong, as capable, as deserving of power, not only in the larger sphere of politics, but in the relationship she has with Erskine. Suffrage itself, interestingly enough, becomes a source of conflict between the two of them. Now, Erskine, of course, was a supporter of women's suffrage. He also fashioned himself to be a political realist. And although he was an anarchist in his heart, in everyday life, he engaged in traditional politics. He stumped for Woodrow Wilson in 1912, and he supported him in 1916. And this is one of those flashpoints between the two of them, because Woodrow Wilson, as a Southern Democrat, refused to come out and openly encourage his fellow Southern Democrats to support suffrage. They were opposed to a federal amendment because they did not want African-American women to get the vote. So Wilson was digging in his heels. The National Women's Party was very angry with Woodrow Wilson. Sara was very angry with him. But Wood, on the other hand, was not all that angry with Wilson. The other issue that was brewing by 1917, when Wilson begins his second term in office, is World War I. And although Wood fiercely opposed imperialism, and what he saw World War I as a war of imperialism, once the nation was drawn into war, he tended to side with those who thought to get on Wilson's case about suffrage is really to distract him, and that during the course of the war, the more appropriate thing is to be more patriotic and not, bug him about this. Well, the National Women's Party was having none of that. And so they began to picket the White House, and they began to picket Wilson, and were putting more and more pressure on him. And they were not met with a great deal of support from President Wilson, or even from a lot of the men of Washington, D.C., who would come and harass them when they were picketing. Eventually, this is a very famous story, some of them were arrested and jailed. And in jail, some of them were force-fed and so on. Well, this whole story about Wilson and the 19th Amendment during the time of war really brought some very angry letters between Erskine and Sara about this. And Wood was just telling her, you women need to wait. And that Sara could not abide. She just could not abide that. And she said to him, you would never say that if it were you who were the disenfranchised one. And then she went on to say, and she said that she used this phrase in several different letters, I am bigger than you. I am bigger than you. And I think what she meant by that was I am braver. I am more committed to human justice. I am more willing to sacrifice for what is right. And in the letter, she was talking about women's suffrage, but I don't think either of them missed the fact that underneath that, she was also talking about, I have been braver. I have been more committed to this relationship than you. I have been more willing to sacrifice for you. So things could get, as I say, quite tense. But as 1918 is unfolding, Erskine finally receives his legal windfall. And that was the thing that allowed him to finally keep his promise to Sara. He did set up the family trusts. He did retire from his law firm more or less. And by August, he moved to California to live with Sara. So we can have the next slide, Isa. So here's a picture of them taken probably not long after he arrived. They're finally together to begin their life of art and beauty and literature together. They had a home first on Russian Hill, a couple of doors down from the house that Wood had rented for Sara. He now bought one on Russian Hill that is still standing. They had wonderful evenings with artists and sculptors, actors and poets and musicians. Some of their political friends like Lincoln Steffens and others would come through as well. But they were really trying to pivot away from politics now and really embrace life of poetry. They eventually built a beautiful home. You can look at the next slide, near Los Gatos. And some of you who live in California or who have lived in California may recognize those two stone cats on the left side because they face the highway between Los Gatos, California and Santa Cruz, and they're still standing today. Well, Erskine and Sara had those created and put up in the mid-1920s. The top picture on the right is a view of the house from the back, actually, with their beautiful outdoor spaces. They littered sculpture, pieces of art throughout the property. And that one, I think Robert Stackpole did, Maya, M-A-I-A. And the glass you can see is a solarium on top of the house itself. And then on the bottom right, you can see what their living room looked like. They had many, many acres of land. It overlooked the Santa Clara Valley. It was a beautiful home, the paradise that they had, that Erskine in particular had long dreamed of. They finally realized at the place that they called the Cats. They created a life that revolved around their love. It revolved around art, nature, poetry. And I make the point in the book that some people don't find the poetry all that exciting. I have to admit, I don't think that it is fabulous poetry. But the life that they created here at the Cats is the work of art that best represented who they were. And it's not just my idea. Lincoln Steffens came to visit them, and that's what he said as well. This is the beauty of both of you realized in your beautiful home. So in some respects, in many respects, I'd say the story of Free Love has a happy ending here. They actually end up together, and they lived together until the end of Wood's life. He died in 1944. But I do want to ask the next question. At what cost did they achieve this beautiful life? On his 74th birthday, which they were spending at the Cats in 1926, Erskine admitted to Sara that their choices had brought sorrow to others, but in his words, our own great and flawless happiness is justification enough for what they had, for the choices they had made. And he added, everyone is happier than would have been possible under a cloak of lies. Well, I think everybody would have agreed that the cloak of lies was not great, but I don't think everybody was happier for what had happened here. Nanny, his wife, Reverend Ergot, would not have agreed. Now, sadly, I have almost nothing from Nanny's hand. Very few letters exist from this era of her life, except for a few that she wrote to Wood when he was living at the Cats, where she would write about the children and the grandchildren, but not about what had happened to her marriage. I only have secondhand accounts, so some of them from Erskine, some from the children's letters. And so the best I can tell you is that, and it won't surprise you, this whole episode and end of her life caused exquisite pain and a great deal of hurt and a great deal of loneliness. Reverend Ergot, on the other hand, did provide me with some really good documentation about how he reacted and tried to deal with his wife's desertion of him. When she first told him, and she told him in a letter actually, that she wrote when she was out on doing suffrage work in Oregon. So he responded to her in a letter. And it is clear he is in deep anguish over this, although he could not have been totally surprised, I think, by it. But he was trying to persuade her to see the folly of her ways. And he was pitching it as a struggle between Christianity and morality and family and righteousness on the one hand, versus atheism and anarchism and selfishness on the other. He and his family, with his relationship and marriage with Sara, represented those first things, and this relationship with Wood represented those other things. The only hope for Sara, he was pleading with her, was to return to him and to Christ. The only solace for her sins would be those offered by Christ's resurrection. So he responds from his faith and from his religious orientation. In his letters to Wood, which come later, he uses many of the same things, but the tone is quite different. He is extremely angry, of course, with Erskine, who he had thought was his friend. And so the two of them go back and forth in really fascinating letters where Ergot is the advocate of Christianity, morality, family, and righteousness. And Erskine is the advocate of freedom and free love and science and those kinds of things. Well, none of this worked, of course, for Sara. She had made up her mind. She had really left behind the religion that she had shared with Reverend Ergot. He did eventually remarry in the mid-1920s. He died later in that decade. I think he died in 1929 when he was in his late 60s, which to me seemed very young. But on his deathbed, he told his daughter, Catherine, to tell Sara that he forgave her. And I only know this because Catherine wrote it in her memoirs. I don't know if she ever told that to Sara, but I think if she did, Sara would not believe that she had done anything requiring forgiveness. So it's clear that both of the spouses suffered. But actually, I think it was the children who suffered the most. Sara had two children when she met Wood. Albert, when the affair began, Albert was 10 and her daughter Catherine was 5. And these two kids were bright, lovely children caught between parents who tried to keep it under control, but just could not always do that. And then of course, once Sara left the family, there are times when Ergot couldn't help himself. He would rage against not only Wood, but also be very angry with the children's mother, and they would see this. So both Albert and Catherine wrote heart-wrenching letters to their mother. They often went long periods of time when they did not see her, when she was involved in suffrage work and so on. Actually, what happens, I should mention this, is she lived in the Bay Area and Ergot came down and lived in the Bay Area too. So her kids were just across the bay. So she did get to see them, but there were long periods of time when she was away. So there are many letters and then conversations that she actually related in her own letters to Wood, in which they say to her, you know, we love both of you. But it was so hard for them to be true to both of them. Secondly, they knew that their mother's love, first and foremost, was for Wood, and they came second in her heart. They managed as best they could with this realization. But Catherine, again, being such a small child when all this was unfolding, and then through the worst sort of aspects of this, suffered, I think, more from the realization that her mother's first love and first focus in life was Wood and not her children. So the two of them had a pretty troubled relationship through most of their lives. Wood's children were also torn between parents, even though they were married and parents themselves. Erskine was the oldest son, and he was especially loyal to his mother, and he was angry with his father. Now, all of the children, there were others who lived in Portland. 4 of the 5 lived in Portland, and one daughter, Lisa, came down to live in California and had a whole different relationship with both Erskine and Sara because she lived so close. But the children in Portland, they felt bereft and to a degree abandoned when Erskine left Portland. And the son, Erskine, was very forthright and honest with his father, and he would do battle with him in letters. And also, he refused to welcome Sara into the family fold as long as his mother was alive. Nanny died in 1933, and only after that did Erskine, the son, begin to soften. His father and Sara did stay with him when they came up for some grandchildren's weddings in the late 1930s. And Erskine and his wife, Erskine the son and his wife visited them at the Cats in those later years. So Wood died in 1944, and Sara lived 30 more years. She died in 1974. The chronological arc of the story is incredible, from 1852 when Erskine was born until 1974 when Sara dies. In 1970, 4 years before she died, Erskine wrote her a letter. He had been working on a book about his father and rereading the letters that his father had sent him earlier in life. And he sat down and he wrote to Sara that he now realized his father's desperate trials with me and my cold failure to understand life and him. And he was expressing regret for the anguish that he had caused his father. And then he added, I have equal sorrow over my long hostility to you. Erskine knew that Sara understood that his unfriendliness reflected his loyalty to his mother and really wasn't personal with respect to Sara. Still, he wished now that he had been more loving earlier in his life. When Sara's daughter, Catherine, turned this letter over to the Huntington, she wrote on it, it was of inestimable meaning to Sara Bard Field Wood. So at the end of Sara's life, there is some, I guess we call it reconciliation there as well. Well, you can do the last slide that I have, which is actually a picture of the cover. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot that I had these wonderful photos of them at the Cats. I'll just say a word about the one on the right. That's Sara's daughter, Catherine, on her wedding day. They married at the Cats. I think it's very interesting that the children of Sara and Erskine all got married. They were not interested in free love relationships. And in fact, when Wood's daughter, Nan, was getting married, he wrote her a long letter in which he offered to write her a kind of prenuptial agreement because, you know, he wanted her to be able to get out of that marriage if it turned out that it wasn't working. But she wasn't interested in that. All the children got married. They had a beautiful wedding. They actually wrote a book called The Beautiful Wedding. They were full into this, even though it wasn't what they had chosen for themselves. They were thoroughly delighted that their daughter had found a wonderful man to marry. His name was James Caldwell. He was an English professor at UC Berkeley, so they were just across the bay from them. And finally, I would like to point out that this was a photograph taken at the wedding by Ansel Adams. So the photo at the gives you the sense of the kind of close, loving relationship that Erskine and Sara had achieved at the Cats. Okay, so the last slide then is a picture of the book cover. I just want to say that I just really have scratched the surface of the story. There is so much more, including the political activities that both Sara and Erskine engaged in the teens and 20s. There are many well-known political and literary friends who make appearances in these pages, their own literary output. There's a lot more in the book. But I want to just conclude before we go to your questions with a little bit of reading from the book where I talk about why I think their story has some significance, or maybe what I'm trying to get at here is what I think the meaning of the emphasis here on their personal, private, and intimate relationship is. So I'm going to do what real writers do usually at these things. They read from their books. So I'm just going to read just a couple of paragraphs here. So why does their story matter? They offer extraordinary insight into the lived experience of their era, a perspective of American radicalism, including in personal relationships, on a granular scale. There is something compelling about looking at the subject from the vantage point where you can see personal desires, choices, and consequences up close rather than only in large-scale panorama. Value comes through probing the individual's struggles to carve out a life of meaning on their terms. They dared to challenge convention by crafting new philosophies of love and politics. They jumped in, took risks, made choices and mistakes, admitted weaknesses and failures, and lived with the consequences. Their relationship transcends the distant or abstract. By drilling down into the particulars, their story becomes more human, comprehensible, and interesting. The aim of this book is neither to venerate nor judge Erskine and Sara. It is to illustrate and try to understand how difficult it is to set a new path, to negotiate freedom and responsibility, to balance love for self with love for others, and how to live up to one's ideals, whatever they might be. Digging deep into this couple's experience is instructive, for its reminders of the endless intricacies and inconsistencies in the human heart and within human relationships. Their bittersweet saga, I have come to understand, prompts people to ponder their own loves and losses, life-changing experiences and missed opportunities, risks and regrets. This can be difficult territory. It can unearth disappointment, pain, mistakes, and personal flaws we might prefer to keep buried. Sara and Erskine did not deny their failings, but instead shared them with us. I am grateful they left such a complete record in an effort to achieve an honest story. 100 years after Clarence Darrow introduced them, Sara and Erskine still have something to say to us about the choices that we make. I don't know if I've written the book Sara and Erskine wanted, but I hope so. And thank you for listening. So, I hope there's some questions or comments.
Hello. Yes, thank you so much for that. That was amazing.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. So we do have some questions coming in. There is actually someone on Facebook who's been commenting with a lot of questions. She's actually doing research on Sara Bard Field's friend, Emma World.
Right, Emma Wald, right.
There you go. And so Emma was a supporter of their relationship, and she wants to know, did Wood and Field have any supporters in Portland, and were they able to spread the message of free love and make anyone in Portland society become more interested in the Bohemian lifestyle?
Okay. Yes, Emma Wald was a very good friend of Sara Bard Field's. In fact, she's the person who recruited her for the Oregon suffrage campaign. There aren't a lot of letters between Emma and Sara, and I'm not sure how much Emma knew and when she knew it about the relationship itself. I presume that she knew that Sara, I knew she knew Sara wasn't happy with their marriage. She was attracted to Wood. But I just really don't have any documentation of what she actually thought about it other than this. When Sara was really becoming quite ill by the end of 1912, because I think of the terrible, situation of living in a very unhappy relationship, a number of people came to Sara's rescue who knew about her relationship with Erskine, was friends with both of them. And so these women primarily banded together to help Sara escape Portland, to help with this idea that she needed to go down to California to get help for what might have been tuberculosis, they thought, and so forth. So there were a group of people who were fellow travelers as radicals, bohemians, and even advocates of free love. I don't know that I would put Emma Wald in that category. I'm just not sure about that. However, eventually, when she goes down to California, she does take her daughter. There's a time when Sara goes into a sanitarium, and Emma Wald comes down and takes care of Catherine and stays with her and helps Sara in that way at that particular moment in time. So that if there's any time when she begins to really understand what was going on with Wood, it was probably then. So it's in those early years, 1912, 1913, that she plays a fairly big role in Sara's life. Later on, Emma goes off to Washington, D.C. She's also very involved in the National Women's Party. And Sara will visit her there, but isn't quite as central a character in Sara's story after 1913 or so. But yes, and finally, there were other people. I don't know that Wood was the Pied Piper of them. He was certainly the most vocal, but there are other very strong and fascinating people like Marie Equi, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, E-Q-U-I, who has been written about, who was also very outspoken as a radical. She was openly gay. You know, there were many other people, not many, it was certainly a core of people who shared their views of love and of life and supported them when they could.
We have another question here. Did you find any hint at why their children chose to live within monogamous relationships? Was it because of the conventions of larger society or a reaction to their parents' less conventional lives?
That's a great question. Well, Wood's children were all married by the time he met Sara, but nevertheless, they knew what he was thinking because he was writing quite publicly about free love. You know, they never said, hey, Dad, you know, I just don't agree. Well, Erskine said, I do not agree with you about this, that's for sure. I think that it was not a reaction to their father or to what they saw happening between their parents. I think they were just, you know, regular traditional people. I mean, you know, this free love stuff is really pretty far out there, pretty radical. And the children just were not fellow travelers on this. And in terms of Sara's children, only her daughter marries. And I think it's quite likely that her choices did reflect a desire to try to avoid the very difficult time she had with her parents and with her mother. She really, as a child, sometimes would kind of act out with Wood and express very natural child's resentment of him. But she did grow to love him, actually, because in many ways he was a wonderful, kind, generous human being. So as she got older, she had a greater appreciation for both Wood and for Sara, but I don't think she wanted to replicate the trauma in her own life. And she had a very happy marriage to James Caldwell.
And I have a question asking if you could speak a little bit more about Wood's legacy in Portland. I believe he was involved in setting up the Portland Art Museum.
Yes, the best source for this is actually Robert Hamburger's biography of Wood, which focuses very much on his public life and his political life. So I think he had his hands in just about everything, including the art museum. He was a painter of sorts. He knew he wasn't particularly good, but he had among his friends very famous artists, including Charles Hassan, who would come out to Oregon and they would go into the desert and paint together. So I know he was very, very interested in art. And so the art museum, I believe the public library, he was very instrumental in the Skidmore Fountain. I don't know, Issa, if you've ever been, do you know where the Skidmore Fountain is in Portland? It's down there. I don't know my Portland streets but it's not too far from Powell's. It's down there pretty close to the water. I wish somebody could
Okay.
put in the chat box, they could tell me exactly where it is. But he was involved in getting the sculptor who created the Skidmore Fountain and was very involved in that. So he had tremendous cultural influence on Portland during his life and for many years after. He is known among people who cared about the things that he cared about, for sure, the radical tradition. And as I said, his family, descendants of Charles Erskine Scott Wood and Nanny Wood, still live in Portland or across the river in Vancouver, Washington. So the family is still very much there in Portland, a great-granddaughter in Eugene and another in Boise, Idaho. So I think they pretty much stayed in the Pacific Northwest. And in many ways, in the choices that they've made, I don't know a lot about the family, but like the great-granddaughter Mary Wood is a lawyer, very involved in environmental law. I think Erskine would just be delighted with that. And there's also a very interesting story about, if I have the time, I don't want to take up too much. Do I have some time?
Oh, go ahead. Tell the story.
So Erskine's father, as I said, made him go to West Point. But Erskine did not make his sons go to West Point. In fact, his oldest son, Erskine, he sent to live with Chief Joseph for several summer falls when he was like a preteen. So that child got to know Chief Joseph and his family and live with the Nez Perce people. And so the relationship that was established really first when Wood met Joseph at the end of the expedition and sat down and spent time with him and possibly embellished the famous surrender speech. From that moment on, there was a connection between the Wood family and Nez Perce people that continues to this day. And so every spring, Erskine Wood, who would be, I guess, the great-grandson of the original Erskine, and his wife welcome them, those that come over to an event that takes place every year at Fort Vancouver, to have a lovely dinner along the banks of the Columbia River. So I would say Erskine had a really important influence on Portland legal life, cultural life, and his family continues the traditions.
Okay, thank you for sharing that story. I did not know that. I would not expect that either.
Oh, I'm sorry, I gotta add one more thing because this is the best part of the story. The last time the kid went out there, Erskine, the father, said, ask Joseph what he would like as a gift, because I'd like to give him something wonderful because he's taken such good care of you. Well, his son did ask, and Joseph said a horse. A horse would be nice, but he forgot to tell his dad, and I guess his dad forgot to ask him, so it never happened. And when Erskine was an older man, he would tell the story to his children, his grandchildren, and express such deep regret that he had neglected to give his father this message. So I forget how many years ago it was now, but the family got together and they found the best Appaloosa horse they could find. And they took it to Oregon, to the reservation, and they gave the horse to a descendant of Joseph. So
I love that.
Tells you something, about Erskine and his family. And so, yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that. Okay. So someone asked if you're familiar with the work of Donna Munker, who has been working on a biography of Sara.
I have never met her. When I was working in the archives at the Huntington, I would see her little notes to Peter Blodgett, who is the wonderful archivist there who knows the Wood collection well. So I knew that she was working on Sara, and a number of people told me about her, and we have corresponded a little bit. She would ask me some questions about Erskine in the Army, because I actually wrote about him not only in my dissertation, but in the book Reimagining Indians. They have a whole chapter on him and that part of his life. And so she was contacting me about that. But I have never met her, and I don't really know what happened to her project. I kind of think that people assume, maybe sometimes when they're working on something, they get very protective about about the subject matter, but I'm not that way. Maybe it's because I've done so much work on Army and wars with Indians. I mean, think about how many biographies there are of Custer, for goodness sakes. I mean, it just seems like there's an endless appetite for it and an endless interest in him, and people want to do it, keep telling stories again. So I hope that she is still working on this, and I would look forward to it. I would love to see how she spins the tale, and because each of us brings who we are to the process, and she may have a very different interpretation and approach to this. So I hope that she is still working on the book, and I would love to read it. And if she is and wants to talk to me, I'd be delighted to talk to her.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we have a question asking, how did Albert's death affect the relationship between Sara and Wood?
So this person knows something that I didn't talk about, but it was really a terrible moment in the book. When Wood came down to California to live, he wanted Sara to learn how to drive. He didn't want to drive a car, but he wanted her to drive the car. So he bought a big car, and she was starting to learn how to drive, but really hadn't had much practice. But one October day, Albert, her son, who was, I think, 17 now at this point, and Catherine came over from Berkeley to visit her on their usual sort of weekend together. Ergot had made it abundantly clear she was never to have the children in the same room with Wood, and she was not following that edict at all. So she decided on this beautiful October day to take the kids over to where where Wood was staying when he first came down, which was in Corte Madera. He wanted to ease into living with Sara because Ergot was very exercised in threatening lawsuits and things like that. So she decided to take the kids over to Corte Madera and take a picnic. And they went up into the Marin Headlands, and to make a long story short, she had an accident, and the car went over a hillside and rolled down the hill, and she and Erskine and Catherine survived, but Albert died. So the question that the person is asking me is, how did it affect Sara and Erskine? Can you just repeat it one more time?
Sara and Wood's relationship.
Okay. Well, Sara was, first of all, badly injured, but more than that, she was grievously hurt by the fact that she had been at the wheel. And it didn't help when Ergot yelled at her, "You killed our son," and it was just unbelievably horrible. So she really suffered for a while, depression, and it lasted for quite some time. And so just at this moment, really, when they were finally going to realize a life together, this terrible tragedy strikes. Erskine stood by her, sat by her side, saw her through it. I don't think it changed their relationship at all. Maybe it strengthened it. Interestingly enough, a few years later, one of Erskine's sons died, which is also a moment in the book that every time I read about it, it makes me cry. Anyway, so they shared the experience of losing a child, but I don't think if anything, it brought them together, but it was a very rocky time for a while there.
Could you share the story of how Wood's son also passed away?
Ooh, I wonder if the person that's asking that question could tell me, because, you mean the one that died that I just mentioned?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I thought you meant Erskine. Okay. Yeah, he was the kind of middle child, and I'm having a moment here where I can't not remember his name, which is terrible. Anyway, he was in his 40s, and he was just a lovely man. He did everything his father wanted him to do, which was be who he was. But he went off to Cornell, and he did great in school, and he came back, and he married, and he had a lovely wife and children and a fine job. And more than that, he was also sympathetic to his father. When we come back to Portland, this son would also not really want to talk about Sara in front of his mother and so forth, but on the side, he would say to his dad, you know, I'm sorry, I wish we could be more open with Sara, but we just can't, and so on and so forth. So he was sympathetic to his father, and of course that Erskine appreciated. So he was like in his 40s, and he just had something happen in the kidney, and he had a excruciating death, which took a couple of days. And so Wood was able to rush back to Portland and be at his son's, Max, I'm sorry, Max is his son's name, Max's deathbed. And, you know, even now I'm sort of emotional when I think about this. He, Wood and his, Erskine and the brothers, the other two brothers, and a friend or two wrapped Max's body in white muslin and put it in a coffin. And his mother wanted him to be buried, not cremated. And so they just all followed the casket to the cemetery, and it was like an autumn day. And, you know, Erskine was so overcome with sorrow that for a moment he could not speak. And for him, it was something. But finally he was able to get control, self-control. And he just said, he was the best son. He never caused me any trouble. And that's something that my dad would say, right? And just what a lovely man he was, and how heartbroken he was. And so, yeah, they both suffered loss. There's lots of suffering actually in this story, and the death of those two sons is certainly part of that.
Oh, thank you for sharing that story. That is, it's definitely hard to lose a child, and I can see how they could bond over that.
Yeah.
All right. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm only going to ask one more question. But do you have an email or that you can give out to folks who have more questions that they want to ask you directly?
Absolutely. If you can put in the chat box, it's, first of all, maybe my website would be a good place to start.
Oh, yeah.
That's www.sherry, that's SHERRYL Smith.com. So www.sherrylsmith.com. My email can be found in that website, but I'll also give it to you now. That is Sherry S, SHERRYS, @smu.edu. S was already taken when I got there, so I had to do Sherry S instead of S Smith.
No worry. So it's Sherry S at MS.
At SMU.
Oh, SMU.
SMU.edu.
.edu.
Or you can also Google me, and you'll find this stuff.
Okay, perfect. So folks, send that's how you can reach Sherry for the remainder of your questions. All right.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear there's more. And please email me any comments, any additional information that you have that would be really interesting to me. I'm done with this project in one respect, but I'm still very, very much interested in learning more.
Perfect.
So thanks.
Right. So for our final question, how did Sara's political activities shape her personal life? Another way that this could be worded that someone asked was, how do you think Sara's political beliefs influenced her relationship with Woods?
Yeah. So in the section that I said, and I went pretty fast, but the suffrage section, I think, is where I was at least hinting at how important her political activities were in shaping her personality and in shaping how she changed over time in the relationship, and how she became more assertive and demanding of him. So when she met, she wasn't all that young, but I would say she was unformed. She wasn't quite yet the person that she was meant to be. And so she had these political activities, whether it was suffrage. She was very much involved in labor issues. She went down to LA. One of her gambits in trying to figure out what she could do to make a living was journalism. And she was there for the very famous McNamara trial. And in all of these experiences, she was getting as I say, a better sense of who she was, what her values were, and finding her voice and exercising that voice. And so it took a while for her to take all of those skills that she was gathering along the way to really shift the power relationship with Erskine itself, but it certainly did happen. And I don't, maybe it would have happened without the political experiences, but in this book, the political and the personal are totally intertwined. And maybe they are always in everybody's lives, but for these two, politics for the first 2/3 of Erskine's life and at least the first half of Sara's were very much devoted to trying to change the world, and in a radical kind of way, sometimes more progressive, maybe not so radical, but they saw themselves as political radicals and as cultural bohemians. And they lived their ideals as much as they possibly could, and they used their treasure and their talents to promote those things that mattered to them. And it was always enmeshed in the personal relationship as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sherry, for speaking with us today about your book. Just as a reminder for everyone, the Sherry's novel or book is out now. You can order it at the Oregon Historical Society's bookstore by either phoning in the bookstore or ordering it online. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, thank you so much, Isa, and the Oregon Historical Society. And I hope to come to Portland one of these days and meet some of you.
Yes, definitely let us know if you're ever in Portland. That way you can come down to the museum and check it out.
Yes, for sure. All right, thanks everybody. Good night.